Well, we made it through the snow, some of us, to get here. It's very deep in Greensboro. Roads are covered. You wouldn't believe it if you hadn't been out, unless you look out your window and you're in the city and there's not much of anything around. Unless you live north, then it's probably a little bit better, more for us. But that's the beauty of live stream. It's great to be able to, you're able to sit at home comfortable in your chair, pajamas still perhaps, and there's still some of us here to be enough of a live audience. I thought of the beginning days of the pandemic when there were just 3 or 4 of us in here at a time, and I was like, well, good thing I've practiced for this morning, but we're here together as God's people, whether we're right here in this very space or all across the globe even. We're connected as God's people through the mighty power of God's Spirit, so that for that we're grateful for the possibility to be together. Today, I really the psalm really spoke to me. I typically preach from the gospel. That's the good news of Jesus Christ for the world. And so it resonates most clearly with my spiritual journey and perhaps with many of you, but also the psalms are there to guide us and to support us and to encourage us. And so today, for me, the psalm made the most attention, although it's connected with this gospel lesson as well. The interdependence upon God and the care of God for all God's people, which I think we probably need to hear once again, especially these days in the middle of COVID and everything else that seems to be going on. This psalm from Psalm 147 is actually near the end of the book of Psalms, and it is near the very end, and those are from 146 to 150 are a series of doxologies, glory words of praise to God at the very end. This Psalm 147 is actually, scholars tell us, a combination of 3 songs of praise. The first 2 are in today's text that we use. And so there's a first section in which there's a restoration of Israel, reordering of the conditions of human beings, and a reminder that God controls the stars. And then the second part of this psalm is praise and thanksgiving, God's provision for all of creation, and a dependence upon God versus a trust in a military might. That one perhaps rang most clearly with me, the very idea of strength and determination that's been seen lately over the past few years, as in belittling of other people in other countries and places, and because of our strength and military might as an American citizenry, versus the power of God at work in the world and a dependence upon God, a humble nature, and an interdependence with each other. Sounded so fitting and a needed reminder for me that comes not only from our scriptures or from our experience, but also our scripture. The psalm reminded us clearly that God can be trusted to care for both the personal and the cosmic. It's not just about way out there or about the stars in the skies, but it's also about us as this people of God, the creation of God, that we are considered important to God. And we probably need to hear that. Sometimes we get left aside or even feel down on ourselves. Oftentimes we're we're our own worst critic, as they say. And so we need to hear that we too are the treasures of God, that we're beloved of God. God is, in fact, incomparable with the ability and power. God does not operate in brute force. Rather, grace, that is the energy for God's power to be revealed. The idea of grace being the revealer of God's power. I thought about this in a kind of a reference to hunting. I've never been hunting, but I love dogs, and I'm amazed at hunting dogs. If I see one of those programs on TV where they're working a field, I'll always watch it almost all the time. The very idea that the shooter, the hunter can flush a quail covey up into the sky and shoot a couple of the birds, and this dog that has the ability to bite and to destroy the newspaper or a hand or whatever else, goes trotting out to the middle of the field and picks up this bird very gently and brings it back to the hunter and lays it at its feet. A well-trained hunting dog. But those powerful jaws that have the power to manipulate and to tear, yet at the same time are fragile with the dove. That's the power of God. God has that ability to smite or to destroy, and yet God chooses over and over again to offer compassion and hope to very hurting people in a hurting world. God's power and God's sovereignty is driven by God's grace. We as Methodists often talk about grace a whole lot. We talk about Wesley's understanding of grace, and you've heard me say it before that if you want to remember the stages of grace, it's please, Jason, stop, prevenient grace, justifying grace, and sanctifying grace. Please, PJS. That was given to me by my first church up in Morganton. They said I talked about grace so much that they made up a mantra on it. Please, Jason, stop. Prevenient grace is the grace that goes before us, that before we even realize God's presence in our lives and in our world working, is that active working in our lives. We talk about that oftentimes with an infant that comes for baptism. That the infant has no way to even get there, and yet through the parents' arms or grandparents, that it comes and is brought to the waters of baptism at the font and offered up. And we, on the behalf of the child, answer those questions that they reject the powers of evil and to work in the world. And through the waters of baptism, even acting on that child is God's grace. It's not our actions, it's not our human actions that's at work there, but it's God's grace at work even before we realize it. In our need for justifying grace that calls us to be able to follow after Christ, to realize that we're not perfect, to realize that we've not always gotten things just right in our lives and in our world, and a dependence upon God to forgive us and to set things aright and anew. And the beginning of a walk towards sanctification. Not that we can ever be perfect, but it means that we're perfect in love in this life. That the things in which stir God's heart and calls God to love and to react and to give are the same things that control our heart and our desires. That wanting to follow after God in everything that we do. The ability to experience God's grace in the fullness. That's a lifelong goal and achievement. One of the great things I love about Methodism and Methodist theology is the fact that our conversion experience is not the be-all, end-all of our life. Yes, it's a high point, and when we choose to follow after God each and every day in our lives, but it's not the end. It's simply the beginning of a transformation of our life at work in the world. This psalm is not one of those that's just off there into the distance. Although it reminds us of the great cosmos and God's power, but it reminds us of the nearness of God to us. That God's not only interested in the world, but that God's interested in us. And if our hearts are aligned with the things that are aligned with God's heart, then it calls us to care for one another, to reach out. In today's world of the pandemic, I wander around, and most people in town are doing a lot better with the mask, but I still see one or two, and I just sit there and shake my head. I mean, I don't shake it at them. Well, I do, but I don't try to show it that I'm shaking at them because you don't know what they're going to do next. But I will say that out of just the simple care for one another, the least that we can do is to try to wait 6 feet apart. I love the people that in the grocery store line, I've done everything and barely touched anything, and they're right up on my heels, and I'm like, will you back up? But it's partly a reconditioning of our lives and a care for one another that's a conscious decision to say, ooh, I need to back up a step. Just to leave a little extra difference, just to wear my mask completely over my nose, just to make sure I wash my hands over and over again and not touch doors. Everybody laughs at me when I kind of go in and out of a building. If the door swings, I don't open it even with my hands or even now my arms. I've gotten to where I just back up against the door. And so I kind of look funny coming out of the post office and trying to hold the door open for people and give them 6 feet of space gets to be a challenge. It's kind of humorous and rather comedic in the 21st century, but maybe we need a little bit of that. I'll do my Jerry Lewis interpretation there at the post office probably tomorrow or Tuesday at some point this week. So if you're there, look out for it. But when we do, when we can reach out, when we just this basic general care one for another is so important. But it's not grounded in our desire to be politically correct or seen as following the rules. It's out of genuine care for one another because we understand as people of faith that God cares for us and we're called to care for others just as God cares for us. It's hard when people get aggravated, or when people are aggravating, when people cut us off in traffic. Oh, you know the things they do that just get on our everlasting nerve. And then when we get so bent out of shape because someone else does something like that, perhaps we need to do a little more soul examining and to realize that our hearts are not fully aligned with the heart of God. You'll never hear me be taken advantage of and encouraging us to be letting ourselves be taken advantage of, but to care for one another with the same care that God cares for us. It's critical to the life of faith and living, chasing after the goodness and the heart of God. This psalm, connected with this text of healing and teaching, of Jesus not only caring for Simon Peter's mother-in-law, but also for healing those that are sick, possessed with demons, to the point of he needs to escape and run away, tired and wearied. But it does remind us of the importance of not only God's caring for the vastness of creation, but for the individual. Oh, the old songs and the ideas of the number on the hairs on our head are numbered and known. God's caring for the sparrow. We've heard that through all kinds of hymns and understanding. And yet sometimes it's awful hard for us to do. We need to hear these reminders from the text to be able to be a part of God's world and God's kingdom, to be able to reach out and to love and to live in God's goodness and God's grace. All glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.